So I selected the topic of women's liberation struggles from abolition to suffrage to civil rights to Black Lives Matter for today's service as a bridge between Black History Month and Women's History Month. Black women's liberation struggles have involved much activism, not only protests, demonstrations, legal fights, and more, but also artistic actions. A writer who comes to my mind is the first African-American poet to publish a book of poetry, and Debbie read us one of her poems. Phyllis Wheatley was born in 1753. Her enslavers, the Wheatleys, unlike most slave owners, taught her to read and write. In 1772, she was required to prove the authorship of her poems in court. It wasn't believed that an enslaved young woman could possibly write and publish poetry. It was in 1778 that she was freed from slavery by John Wheatley's will. She used her poetry to fight against the inequality encouraged by slavery. Initially, her poetry was regarded as a threat to the conventional style of society. But with time, anti-slavery proponents began to use her poem to prove that no race was superior to another. The parade of artistic female activists include Toni Morrison, whose novels and nonfiction deal with racism and other forms of oppression. Her 1987 novel, Beloved, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1988, is based on the life of an American enslaved woman. Morrison won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. In her book of essays, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, Morrison writes, "My work requires me to think about how free I can be as an African-American woman, a writer in my genderized, sexualized, and wholly racialized world." An Englewood resident, Faith Ringgold, is an artist whose medium is paint. According to an article that appeared recently in the Northern Valley Suburbanite, she experienced racism when she moved into her Jones Road home. In 1992, she wanted to add a 2-story artist studio behind her home. At a 1993 Board of Adjustments meeting, there was a full house of hostile neighbors, as she remembered it. And she said, one after another, they testified that my artist studio was really a ploy to build a 2-family dwelling, which would create a parking lot in front of my house and diminish the quality of life. In other words, there goes the neighborhood. Blatant racism. Her neighbors brought her to court and they lost. Ultimately, Ringgold got her studio. She has long been a political activist and voice for the disenfranchised, especially African Americans and all women. There are so many more Black female artists representing just about every genre of creativity who use their art to fight liberation and to fight oppression and to seek true liberation. Now back to the more distant past. The most well-known female abolitionist is Harriet Tubman, known as the Moses of her people. We are all familiar with how she resisted slavery, shepherding upward of 300 enslaved people to freedom. She never lost a single passenger during about 19 missions as a conductor, traveling mainly by night through dangerous territory. Her understanding of botany, wildlife, geography, and astronomy allowed her to guide herself and others to safety across the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania. If anyone decided to turn back, thereby endangering the mission, she reportedly threatened them with a gun and said, "You'll be free or you'll die." Less known is the fact that during the Civil War in 1863, after serving as a cook, nurse, scout, and spy, she was the first woman in America to plan and lead an armed rebellion. She led the raid at the Combahee Ferry, using her intelligence information to navigate around the Confederate mines placed in the Combahee River in coastal South Carolina. The mission successfully rescued more than 700 enslaved people from the plantations along the river. Prior to this, in 1859, she helped John Brown plan his raid of a Harper's Ferry arsenal. He referred to Tubman as General Tubman. Later, a bill in the Senate to pay Tubman $2,000 for service to the Union Army as a nurse, scout, and spy in the Civil War was defeated in 1894. After the Civil War, she moved to Auburn, New York, helping the poor, establishing home for the elderly on her property, working for women's suffrage, and so much more. Truly an amazing woman. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, was an abolitionist and a women's rights activist. She was born into slavery and escaped with her infant daughter in 1827. She became a charismatic speaker, and in 1843, she declared that the Spirit called her to speak the truth, and then she renamed herself Sojourner Truth. As an itinerant preacher, she met Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison's anti-slavery organization encouraged her to give speeches on the evils of slavery. In 1851, Truth began a lecture tour that included a women's rights conference in Akron, Ohio, where she gave her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, which Rhonda read so eloquently and passionately before. She challenged prevailing notions of racial and gender inferiority and inequality. During the Civil War, she encouraged young men to join the Union cause, and she organized supplies for Black troops. After the war, she was honored with an invitation to the White House and became involved with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping freed enslaved people find jobs and build new lives. While in Washington, D.C., she lobbied against segregation. Ultimately, Truth split with Douglass, who believed suffrage for formerly enslaved men should come before women's suffrage. She thought both should come simultaneously. It's not surprising that both Tubman and Truth fought for women's suffrage as well as abolition. They understood the connections among oppressions. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery and freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. She was an investigative journalist, educator, suffragist, and early leader in the civil rights movement, becoming one of the founders of the National Association of Colored People. In 1884, she filed a lawsuit against the Chesapeake, Ohio, and Southeastern Railroad, citing discrimination based on her race after she was assaulted by a train conductor for refusing to leave a train that was designated whites only, a train car. She led an anti-lynching campaign in the 1890s, cataloging 241 lynchings. Wells worked for women's suffrage. She openly confronted white women in the suffrage movement who ignored lynching as an issue. Because of her stance, she was often ridiculed and ostracized by women's suffrage organizations. Her campaign against violence for equality led the groundwork for the revolutionary civil rights movement. For a long time, her efforts were largely unknown because she was African American and a woman. And it's just so both interesting and discouraging to see how racism impacted the suffrage movement, how sexism impacted the struggle for suffrage. I mean, just to see, the struggles within the movements. Rosa Parks was a revolutionary civil rights fighter. I think that one of the reasons why just about everyone knows her name is that she has been portrayed as a tired, demure Black woman who refused to give up her bus in the colored section to a white man in 1955. She was indeed tired. She was tired of Jim Crow racism. The fact that her action was a carefully calculated political act that led to the Montgomery bus boycott has been unknown to most people. Parks attended a school that developed civil rights leaders, and she was mentored by civil rights activist Septima Clark. She was selected for this action because she was married, employed, enjoyed a reputation for good character, and was one of the finest citizens of Montgomery. And yet she was so radical. Starting before the bus boycott, Parks was active in the NAACP and championed the cause of the Scottsboro Boys, a group of young African men falsely accused of raping a white woman. She also campaigned for 2 Black women who had accused a white man of raping them. Working against the sexual abuse of girls and women was an important issue for Parks, and also another typically unknown one of her liberation issues. Septima Clark was a pioneer in grassroots education. She developed the literacy and citizen workshops that played an important part in the drive for women's rights and civil rights. She was called the mother of the civil rights movement. She studied under W.E.B. Du Bois at Atlanta University. After graduation, she became a teacher. In 1956, when South Carolina passed a statute that prohibited city and state employees from belonging to the NAACP, she refused to resign her membership and was fired from her teaching position after 40 years of teaching. In 1976, the governor of South Carolina reinstated her teacher's pension after declaring she had been unjustly terminated. And in 1979, she was given a Living Legacy Award by President Jimmy Carter. Fannie Lou Hamer was a voting and women's rights activist. She was a community organizer and leader in the civil rights movement. She was vice chair of the Freedom Democratic Party, which she represented at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. She was born the 20th child to poor sharecroppers in Mississippi. In 1961, a hysterectomy was performed on Hamer by a white doctor without her consent while undergoing surgery to remove a uterine tumor. This widespread surgery was done to reduce the Black population and was dubbed a Mississippi appendectomy. She became a student nonviolent coordinating committee organizer in 1962 and led 17 volunteers to register to vote at the Indianola, Mississippi courthouse. Denied the right to register by an unfair literacy test, the group was harassed on their way home by police, who stopped them and fined them $100 for the trumped-up charge that their bus was too yellow. Soon after, Hammer was fired from her job from trying to vote. In 1963, after successfully completing a voter registration program in Charleston, South Carolina, Hamer and several other Black women were arrested for sitting in a whites-only bus station restaurant in Mississippi. At the jailhouse, she and several of the women were brutally beaten, leaving Hamer with lifelong injuries from a blood clot in her eye, kidney damage, and leg damage. In 1964, Hammer, who co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the local Democratic Party's efforts to block Black participation, the group went to the Democratic National Convention and called for integrated delegations. President Lyndon Johnson held a televised press conference when she was ready to speak, so she wouldn't get any television airtime. However, her speech was televised later. In 1964, Hamer helped organize Freedom Summer, which brought hundreds of Black and white college students to help with African-American voter registration in the South. She then helped to found the National Women's Political Caucus. Later, frustrated with politics, she turned to economics as a strategy for greater racial equality. In 1969, she launched the Freedom Farm Collective, buying up land that Blacks could own and farm collectively. With the assistance of donors, including Harry Belafonte, she purchased 640 acres and launched a co-op store, boutique, and sewing enterprise. She single-handedly ensured that 200 units of low-income housing were built. She was an amazing, amazing activist. In 1977, Hamer died of breast cancer at age 59. Florence Kennedy was a fiery Black lesbian feminist and civil rights lawyer. She was born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1960, and when a white mob tried to push her family out of the neighborhood, her family faced down the mob and stayed. In the 1930s, she helped organize a boycott of a Coca-Cola bottler that wouldn't hire Black workers. Along with her sister Grace, Kennedy refused to leave a segregated bus restaurant at a bus station in Missouri, and she was dragged out by a white crowd, which caused a lifelong injury to her back. She sued the restaurant and bus company and won her case. When she applied to the Columbia University Law School, at first, the law school wouldn't admit her. She thought it was because she was Black, but it was because she was a woman. But later, they rescinded, and she earned her degree. In 1959, she represented Billie Holiday, ill with liver disease, on charges stemming from previous drug arrests. She was able to keep Holiday out of police custody while the singer was dying in a New York hospital. She went to court on behalf of Holiday's estate and the estate of jazz musician Charlie Parker, and she successfully forced the musicians' management and record labels to pay royalties owed. She was a lawyer who spoke out against racial and gender injustice during the protest-filled 60s and 70s. In the 1980s, my friend Lori had the pleasure of spending a weekend with Flo Kennedy on Fire Island, along with a host of other lesbian feminist. She described Kennedy as having a booming voice, a truly different and unforgettable personality. Kennedy was an activist during the civil rights and Black Power movements. Among her clients were several Black Panthers and the woman who shot Andy Warhol. Although she was active in the fledgling National Organization of Women, when it became too mainstream for her, she founded the Feminist Party to support the run of Representative Shirley Chisholm in 1972. She was flamboyant and almost always wore a cowboy hat. Her activism led to fundamental change, including New York to become the first state to legalize abortion. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman to be elected to the United States Congress, representing the 12th District in New York, a district centered on Bedford-Stuyvesant. And she was elected for 7 terms from 1969 to 1983. She was an outspoken advocate for women and for minorities. In 1972, she was the first woman and African-American to seek the nomination for President of the United States from one of the 2 major political parties. Angela Davis is one of today's great Black women who has been in liberation struggles all of her life. She is a Marxist and feminist political activist, philosopher, academic, author, and was a member of the Black Party and the Communist Party. She was active in the civil rights movement and Black liberation movements, and she is an advocate for prison abolition. I must confess that Angela Davis is one of my greatest sheroes. We were both born in 1944. We both have been academics, but I don't have her long publishing history. Later, like her, I was arrested, but not for a highly publicized event. I was merely a civil disobedience protester at a nuclear weapons research site. I did get to ride in a New York City Police Department paddy wagon, but unlike Davis, my face didn't appear on the FBI's most wanted list, and I never served any jail time. Davis grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Birmingham, dubbed Dynamite Hill, due to the many African-American homes in the area that were bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. As a teenager, Davis organized interracial study groups, which were broken up by the police. In the 1960s, she was involved with the Soledad brothers, who were accused of killing a prison guard, and she was jailed for 18 months for charges related to an escape attempt during the trial of George Jackson, one of the Soledad brothers, when several people in the courtroom were killed. She was charged with murder because the guns that were used were registered in her name, and she was reportedly in love with Jackson. She was cleared of the murder charge and then released in 1972. Davis was hired to teach at the University of California at Los Angeles, but due to her association with communism, she was fired. But she fought the administration in court and got her job back. She then chose to leave the position and took another teaching position in Santa Cruz. In 2017, Davis was a featured speaker and made an honorary co-chair of the Women's March on Washington after Donald Trump's inauguration. I remember that day. Along with colleagues, I participated in this historic march. Tarana Burke is the largely unknown founder of the Me Too movement, a movement she founded in 2006 to help women to stand up for themselves against sexual predators. Burke was raped and assaulted as a child and again as a teen. Her mother helped her recover from these violent acts and encouraged her to be involved with the community. Burke's experiences inspired her to work to improve the lives of girls who undergo extreme hardships. Over a decade later, Me Too became a hashtag when actor Alyssa Milano and other women began to tweet about the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse cases. Burke is currently senior director at Girls for Gender Equity in Brooklyn. And now we come to Black Lives Matter. This movement was founded by 3 queer Black women, a fact that isn't typically known or highlighted. They are Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. In 2013, the women created a Black-centered political will and movement building a project which was begun as a social media hashtag, Black Lives Matter, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Tyrone Martin in 2012. The movement grew nationally in 2014 after the deaths of Michael Brown in Missouri and Eric Garner in New York. Since then, it has established itself as a worldwide movement, particularly after the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis. Most recently, Black Lives Matter has spearheaded demonstrations worldwide protesting police brutality and systemic racism that overwhelmingly affects the Black community. According to the Black Lives Matter website, its mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the police and vigilantes. Alicia Garza is currently the Special Project Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Patrisse Cullors stayed with the Black Lives Matter organization the longest of the 3, but then she suffered a mental breakdown due to pressure within the organization and slander, which accused her of using Black Lives Matter money to buy lavish homes. This was untrue, but Cullors suffered and feared for her life, especially from white supremacists. Opal Tometi, now known as Ayo Tometi, is a Nigerian immigrant who was the former executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and continues to work for human rights. It is amazing how many, actually all of these women continued working against racism, for human rights, past their most noted aspects in their lifetimes. Before I conclude, I want to say there are so many Black women who have struggled for liberation, including Pauli Murray, Dorothy Pittman Hughes, Ella Baker, Dorothy Height, Audre Lorde, Coretta Scott King, Bell Hooks, Assata Shakur, Elaine Brown, and Anita Hill, to name only a few. But I had to resist, lest I had gone on for hours. I will conclude with what Angela Davis says about Black Lives Matter. If indeed all lives mattered, we would not need to emphatically proclaim that Black Lives Matter. Or, as we discover on the Black Lives Matter website, Black women matter, Black girls matter, Black gay lives matter, Black bi lives matter, Black boys' lives matter, Black queer lives matter, Black men matter, Black lesbians matter, Black trans lives matter, Black immigrants matter, Black incarcerated lives matter, Black differently abled lives matter. Yes, Black lives matter, Latino, Asian American, Native American, Muslim, poor and working class white people's lives matter. There are many more specific instances we would have to name before we can ethically and comfortably claim that all lives matter. Thank you.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.